Oh, good of you to all come along first thing in the morning. I've got a few disclaimers to begin with. I'm not a Kiwi, I'm a Queenslander. And yeah, if you don't know the difference, we're the ones who beat you 10 years in a row. Kiwis didn't do that. That was Queensland. I thank those guys for wearing maroon in the audience too. It was good of you. I appreciate that. It was a nice thought. So.
I reckon someone asked him when he was little, what do you want to do when you grow up? And he said, hey.
Yeah, that's DNA, yeah, that's good. So anyway, I've worked in New Zealand for 15 years, so I really enjoy it, and certainly learnt an awful lot about pastures in New Zealand that I didn't know when I went there, so we'll get through a little bit of that today. Can everyone hear me up the back? Can you hear me all right? How about you guys? Yep.
You could be better.
Could be better, I'll shout up louder then, all right? So today, this discussion note is about production in dry times, not survival. So we're going to spend our time between them in the different groups that we've been to. Some places are worse than others, I'm told. Been very instructive to talk to the farmers over the last couple of days about what's going on, and clearly it's terribly dry. We will spend our time talking about production in this and also some of its survival. I want to do a few things. The first one is, I think it's much easier for you to make decisions about feed if you understand some fundamentals about ruminant nutrition that I personally don't believe are always taught very well. And I think the first thing I'll say about this is that ruminant nutrition is often put across as being a tremendously complex issue. And I want to take a different view with you today to show you that actually the principles that you need to know to understand on it are relatively straightforward, and that you can rank those priorities without too much difficulty at all, and you should. So we'll spend a little while in Ruminant Nutrition 101, if you like. The next one will be quite specific on dry feeding, using that information to say, okay, if I'm in this situation, what do we do? If I'm going to rank them like this, what do I do? I then want to spend a little while on witchcraft and all the witchcraft that gets sold to you, and to give you some tools to say what might be positive and what might be negative and why. Or another way of putting it, what's more important and what's less important in the decisions that I'm making. And I'll spend a little bit of time on that, and I'm happy to take questions on it too. And then the final bit, we'll do some practical feeding. Which stock do I spend my time on, and what are some positive diets? Some you will all be using. Over the last few days I've noticed there's some potential diets around that people aren't using, so we might spend a little bit of time on them as well. Now, you're welcome to ask questions anywhere along the way, I don't mind. I'll say two things with it. I'm easy distracted, so if you ask me questions, you never know where we end up. And there's a time end to this one, so that's one. The second one is, if there's something that you've got burning in your heart and it's your sacred cow, be very careful asking me a question. Because if you ask me an honest question, I will give you an honest answer. I really will give you an honest answer. So if it's something that's very, very dear to you and you're frightened to get a contrary answer, don't ask it, because I'm not your man, all right? Where I live and work is about equal latitude to Hobart, and I spend most of my time, I guess, a couple of 100 kilometres south of Hobart, so it's a genuinely different climate. It is pretty nippy, and in winter we don't grow any grass at all just because of the temperature. Often have some snow, have a tremendous number of pretty heavy frosts on it as well. But New Zealand grows a lot of ryegrass. In fact, I don't think there's a country in the world that grows ryegrass like it. I think God built the South Island just to grow ryegrass as a sort of demonstration farm, to be honest. You know, it's a perfect climate in lots of ways. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, and it's very productive land. As an example, the land that one of my students is working on there is about $50,000 a hectare, and it's not the most expensive land there. So some of these places can grow under pivot irrigation. They grow about 21 tonnes of ryegrass a year. So you don't find too many places around like that. A very different scenario. Yet a lot of things in ruminant nutrition are just about the same, and I guess we'll explore through that as we go. Okay, so the first one I want is Ruminant Nutrition 101. And I said to you before, and I want you to hear this really clearly, it's often presented as a sort of a dark art, that there's so much involved that nobody but a computer can do it. And if you don't have a fancy program or something else, you can't make head nor tail of it. Well, it's completely wrong. That's completely wrong. So I want to present you a different schemata to work with. And the first one is this simple. We'll put a line here. Really, ruminant nutrition has this ranking. The first and foremost one is energy supply. Now we're going to spend a fair bit more time on that one, but it's energy supply. The second one, and it's a distant second one, is protein supply. And then everything else after that, all of the fibre, all of the macro, micronutrients and minerals, etc., while they're important and they have a place and they need to be addressed, in the scheme of importance, they're so far down that they just don't matter. What really matters is energy, and we're going to spend our time on that one. I wonder if someone can get to the light switch for me. Well, I'm going to go through a process here for you. I'm going to pretend, I don't think it's true, but I'm going to pretend that electricity that came to here came from the snowy hydro scheme, okay? So, first of all, first law of thermodynamics in energy. It is not, in thermodynamics in general, energy is not created nor destroyed. Right? It's not created, it's not synthesized, nor is it broken down. All it does is moves. It moves from one form to another, one form to another. So this started with gravity pulling some water downhill, kinetic energy, rolled that turbine around, became electrical energy, made its way to here. Turn the light on for us again, please. We switched the light on. Now it's light energy, and if I put my hand close enough to it, I could feel some heat. All the way along, it lost some, wasn't broken, it just discarded some because it was not a perfectly efficient system. But the principle behind it is it was simply an energy transfer. The whole way along it was an energy transfer. Okay, I want to show you something with ruminant nutrition. And the first one is, no exceptions to this, everything you produce out of the gate, everything, doesn't matter whether you're here today as a chicken egg producer, I don't care, everything that goes out of your gate is an energy product that started with the sun. You have no exceptions on that. Every last part of that started with the sun. All of that energy that you put out your gate, whatever it is, red meat, fleece, milk, eggs, alpacas, I don't care, it all started with the sun. So what we have is a pretty straightforward system. That light energy was trapped by green feed. Now I don't mind if you're feeding cereal grains at the moment, you say it's not green, it was grown by green leaf. Every bit of it was grown by a green material that captured that light and changed that light energy into a chemical bond. And that chemical energy is what you sell. It's what you sell. So, the most important thing I want you to get with energy transfer in ruminant nutrition holds right here. All of that feed and all of your diet, the most important function that it does is transfer that energy from the feed to the animal. And the way that it mostly does that, there's a few exceptions around the side further on, but 75+% of where it does that is in the rumen. Just in the rumen, the first of those stomachs, okay? So, here's where the witchcraft becomes involved, right? The first thing we want to say about this one is, we said before, first law of thermodynamics, energy is not created nor destroyed. So here's a rule that you can bet on. If you put 100 units of energy in here, you will not get 150 units out here, no matter what they sell you. No matter what magic potion you use, no matter what arrangement you use, nothing else will change that fact. If you put 100 units in here, you will get less than 100 units out here. And what is the driver for that? What is the most important driver for that? And it's pretty easy, intake. So it gets lost in the talk about ruminant nutrition, because what happens is people start talking about the minutiae. They start talking about the smaller things that in the minors, if you like, that in the scheme of it don't really matter. So people began talking about, okay, what can I do down in here to make this more efficient? Or what can I do down here to get more out of this or more out of that? I've got a potential down here to move about 5%, no matter what I do in here really, in the scheme of things, about 5%. I've got a potential in my intake to make management shifts, very simple management shifts, that move at 20 or 50%. So you can see in the scheme of things, what really drives my production in the end, I'll take one more, what drives my production in the end out here is not some shift that I have down here in the rumen, but simply my intake. If you want to write something on your mirror where you're shaving or whatever you're doing in the mornings that you can look at every day, go home and write the word intake. Because all of your profitability and all of your production depends on intake, and nothing but intake. Ask yourself at the end of the day or the morning, did my intake go up? Because if it did, your profitability went up. If your intake did not go up, your profitability didn't go up. And there's no real exceptions on that. There's some minor tweaks around the side which we can address in questions if we need to, but the principle never changes. The driver for energy out the gate is energy into the rumen, and the only way that that gets into the rumen is through intake. So this cartoon is Sid Harris from the 70s, very famous science cartoonist. And over here you've got a young guy, and if you can't see that up the back, the young guy's written an equation over here, big equation over here, and then he's written an equation over here. And he's got the older guy looking at it, because in the middle, what the young guy wrote is, here's my big equation, equals, and then he wrote, then a miracle occurs. And then he's got the rest of the equation. Well, I want to be the one to tell you, there's no miracles that are occurring in there. It is very straightforward. It is very straightforward, and it runs according to process. Everything that you have going out the gate is just a response to the energy intake in that rumen. So going back to what we said before with ruminant nutrition, to make it pretty straightforward, and this applies to low-cost feeding in dry times, this is where we're going to get to on it all. The first and most important thing on it is to say it's energy that you should concentrate on. Ronald Reagan was apparently very famous as a man who had great focus. Everyone sort of thought of him as a bumbling fellow who was an actor and whatnot, but apparently he was a man of great focus. And he had a saying, and I think about this with intake a lot. He used to say to them, I'm here only to hunt lions. I'm not here to hunt antelopes. I'm not hunting anything else. I'm only hunting lions. And what he meant by that is, I've got the big picture in front of me and I'm going to stay focused on that and not get distracted. If we have a big picture in ruminant nutrition, it's pretty simple. Right on your mirror, intake, intake. Now what I'd like to do is spend a moment on protein, and then I want to go back to energy and some practical ways that you can think this through, particularly at the moment. So if we described energy as the fuel that pulled the car along, then protein will be the steel. Protein's the scaffolding that holds it, that allows it to do what it should do. So proteins are used in a few different places. Clearly, proteins are what you sell in the end, in red meat, in fleece. It doesn't really matter for that matter for milk, or again in alpacas. It's still protein that you're selling. That energy is held within that scaffolding. But proteins also enable those processes, because they're all the biochemical, hormonal, regulatory enzymes, etc. They're all proteins as well. So proteins are not unimportant, but I want to be really clear on it. In the scheme of things and the way you think about it, what often happens is protein gets put up there first. Well, the difference is, if you keep feeding them energy until they stop eating, you make more money. If you keep feeding them protein, you go bankrupt. But beyond a certain level, they don't need any more protein, they won't use any more protein, and it's much more expensive. Energy is the dominant one. Protein is a distant second. Now, the second thing I want to say, I want to introduce something, because we'll come to it later in questions, no doubt, when we discuss actual feeds. So there's a difference between monogastrics and ruminants. So this morning we had bacon and eggs, and thank you to the two lasses at the back who cooked that up for us. Now, you and I and pigs, when we eat that, what we do, so here's a schematic. You don't have to learn this. You won't get tested on it the way out the door, I promise. But what we have is, if we have one of these proteins that really looks like that, if we go down and look at the basic units, it's just got these amino acid building blocks, just a basic building block. Now, when you and I eat that bacon and eggs, we just chop it to that basic building block, take it into the blood, send it to where we need it, and rebuild it using that building block, that same building block. Now, most of you will know that's not how ruminants work. They don't work like that at all. What they do is they take that protein, that plant protein, and they smash this to pieces. In fact, the only thing that's left is this little tiny nitrogen up here, the little green one. That's all that's left, a single nitrogen with some hydrogens hanging off it, just a very basic one. And what they then do is that ammonia, and that's what it is taken up by all the rumen microbes into their bodies, if you like. That's what the bacon and eggs of the sheep or the cattle beast is. It's taken up into their bodies, and then they sweep them further down the gut and digest all the bacteria. So their bacon and eggs, if you like, is bacteria. But when they build those amino acids, they don't build the same ones. So they can take in any amino acids, smash them to pieces, and they build their own amino acids. And those amino acids suit red meat, they suit milk, they suit fleece, etc. Okay? So what that really means is, when we're talking about protein nutrition in ruminants, we're not stuck like you and me, or pigs. If any of you have grown pigs, you'll probably know lysine, for example, is one amino acid that's often limiting. You've often got to supply it in extra rations with it. They're not limited to that, and it means that we can feed them other nitrogen sources that are not proteins. Now, proteins are expensive, and other nitrogen sources, urea, for example, are usually pretty cheap. So there's a shift in what we can do and the way we can apply it. And we'll get around to that with molasses and urea mixes a little later on. All right, and then under this line, we're going to write other, and we're not going to spend too much time talking on them at all. A little bit on fibre. Tim's spoken around macro minerals, so you should take all that on board, and I'll reiterate again. There's a place for trace element nutrition. There's a place for mineral nutrition in general, and they're important, and you have to meet some requirements. In the scheme of things though, if you major on those things, and so many times people do or are led to do, you end up losing production and losing money because they are not the dominant ones. Energy is the dominant one, and energy is where you should spend all of your time and attention. Now, you're allowed to disagree with me, and you're allowed to heckle me, and you're allowed to ask questions. So I won't just march on for it. There's a section that I want to spend on here to say how we would rank them. It just follows from what we've said. So what I want to do here is to note this one first. We talk about supplementary feeding. So I'm going to assume that it's going to rain sometime soon, and when it does, we'll be back to normal, which is what we're going to say is we're going to have a forage base, and if we're giving these other feeds, we're supplementing a forage base. Now I know at the moment some of you are probably 100% feeding, so that's not quite the same. That might be true drought feeding, which we'll get to in a minute. But in general terms, if we're talking about forage systems on a pasture base, we're going to say there's a supplementary feed that we're putting in. Now what this is, pardon me, what this is a pretty straightforward way of thinking about it. What's my ranking again? And what role do these decisions on this play? Now in true supplementary feeding, I can balance these things up because they're more important. I know I have to give them some attention, but they're far less attention than energy. Now when the wheels really fall off in drought feeding, what happens is energy rises, proportionately rises again to be more and more important. And they're less and less important in terms. Now that's both in holding body condition and then finally in survival feeding. Both of those are exactly the same. There's a difference between that and normal supplementary feeding. So this is what we'll say. Now, if we were to take the first one, and we're talking about in dry times, we're talking about maintaining normal production. Well, functionally what we get to with that is lotting, one way, shape or form, both for cattle and sheep, lotting. So I'm providing a full diet, and that can be an effective system. Grain prices going up put a lot of pressure on that clearly, but what we would say with that is compared to the others, it's a fairly expensive way to go about it. Now it might generate more cash flow, we'll get to that later because that's important. So it might be that it's a perfectly legitimate option, but we should note first, compared to these ones, it's going to be more expensive. Okay? The next one to say on it is, all right, I'm just holding them in that bracket. Now there's a different feeding approach if we take that, and that might include some of the non-protein nitrogens we said, urea, molasses, some others, there's some various options. In general terms, that's less. And then finally, I'm just keeping them alive. And in those cases, it's less expensive again to do them, but your reward, of course, over that period is also less. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on the bottom two to say, okay, the top two, to say, again, how does our hierarchy work if we're either in full lotting or we're trying to hold those conditions? Well, for both of them, we're going to spend a little bit more time. Normally, we'd spend a little bit more time balancing that diet in terms of protein, minerals, etc. like that. We'd spend a bit more time. When we come around to just holding on, those things progressively begin to drop away. Because in the scheme of things, your great need and your concentration really ends up being almost entirely on the energy supply. Righto, before I go to the next section, any questions on that? All right, you're a very quiet audience. Okay, so now we're going to spend first on energy, and then we're going to go and talk on protein, and we're going to I want to make these decisions. What do I really want? What's my wish list if I'm going to spend my time thinking about, I'm going to purchase in energy, I'm going to prioritise energy, how should I go about it? Okay, well the first and obvious one is that I want the lowest cost. No question around that. All things being considered, I want the lowest cost. I'm going to come back to a point in a little while. When we say lowest cost, do I mean the lowest cost per tonne or per dry matter? Or do I mean the lowest cost per unit energy? Because you know, they're not always the same. And that's something to think about. And there are some things to think about when we're buying energy on that basis. We'll spend a bit more time on that. What else do I want? Well, if I'm going to truck it in and I'm going to handle it and I'm going to put it out, I really want it to be as dense as I can. I don't really want to have more space. If I don't, I want it to be as dense as I possibly can. There's a big difference in me buying in units of metabolizable energy in a wheat load than there is in a wheat straw load. At the moment, I see on the highways there's plenty of trucks rolling around with lots of straw and lots of hay on it. I don't imagine too many of those trucks are very heavy. You know, they seem to have plenty piled up on them, but I don't think they're particularly heavy. So in the scheme of things, for me, it makes more sense on it if I'm going to have all my costs reduced because it's more energy dense. What else do I want? I want some sort of robust storage. I don't want it to be a really difficult storage. There are some that are difficult storage. Windrows and other bits and pieces, quite difficult to do. And then the final one is I want to be able to use it. Ultimately, I want to be able to use it in a way that's relatively hassle-free. So if we stick with cereal grains at the moment, one of the issues which Tim brushed over was acidosis. You know, the capacity to poison them when you start using cereal grains is real. And there is some sort of adaptation process that needs to be done for that, and that's real. Now it's easy and it's managed, but it's real. There's some other feeds. For example, in New Zealand, the best example I know, 1 million tonnes a year of palm kernel extract comes in to New Zealand. It's a granular feed, looks a little bit like a dry cottonseed meal if you haven't seen it before. A very cheap feed, high protein, reasonably high energy, and it is absolutely bomb-proof. It goes in the shed, lasts there for ages, nothing seems to eat it. It doesn't spoil, it doesn't go off. You put it out in the paddock, from day one they can eat as much as they want, and you know they get used to it really easy. It's the classic example of the hassle-free feed. So when I'm looking at this one, I have to make some decisions around it to say, well, you know, what am I ranking? Now, nearly always, the first and most important ranking will be lowest cost. But these others do come into play. We're going to spend a moment, before we go on to talk about protein for the same thing, we're going to spend a moment just going over some energy rankings, all right? And well, I've added here some protein and some fibre because I want to refer to them later. But the main part that I want you to look at is this first column here, which is the energy rankings. Now, metabolizable energy is the system that we judge a feed's energy value to the animal on. We don't have to spend too much time on it, but it's just a system that we judge it on. How much energy to the animal does that feed provide per dry kilogram? So per kilogram dry matter, how much energy does it provide? Now, for all of these feeds that I've put up, I'm going to talk about most of them in a minute and a couple more, those actual figures can change. So you can, agronomically, you can shift them up and down, you can move them around. There's a range for all of them. What doesn't change much is the ranking. So I'm more interested in demonstrating something to you along the lines of the ranking. But what I do want to show you is you don't need very much material, and it's easily available information. The DPI has this information on its site. You don't need much material to start making some decisions for yourself on your purchases, particularly when you're buying all of your feed in. What do I mean by that? All right, over here, we're going to have the grains up here. Now, I'll just add one proviso. In laboratory tests, protein is a very easy test, and the results that you get back for protein tests will normally be very accurate. When you're testing the energy supply, you're actually usually testing the digestibility of the feed. That is not such a straightforward test, and for some reasons which perhaps we'll go over in questions not now, there typically is a range, and between laboratories and suppliers, etc., you'll find some differences. There's a little more variation in that, we might put it that way. Not in crude protein and typically not in fibre. Both of them are pretty sort of robust assays. So the first thing I'd say with this is, if we look at these, you can see this ranking. So the gold standard, if you like, is wheat. And you'll often see wheat up at 12, sometimes 13. Occasionally you see some much higher figures for them. I don't personally believe that at all, but you see some figures for it. But that 12 or 13 is a pretty good figure for wheat. And it's higher than what the others are. Now, note between the grains, as we move down there, we get down lower and lower, and as they get more and more fibrous, and this is fibre over here, and they have more or less starch, or that starch is more or less available. I didn't put it in because I thought you might have too much frost sensitivity here, but I could have put sorghum in here, and it would be underneath all of these as a grain, because the starch involved in that has these protein complexes. They're not always available. So as you move down that line, you have less and less energy for the same kilogram that you're buying. So if I look at wheat up here, or wheat straw down the bottom, which we'll come to at the moment, I might move from 12 or 13 down to 6. So if I'm buying that on a tonne basis, what I'm paying for it should, if I'm sensible, should reflect the amount of energy I'm buying, shouldn't it? Now there's more to that story and we'll get to it, but the first instance is you can make some decisions about buying it in. Now in New Zealand it's reasonably common to buy it on ME. In other words, you're not just buying it by tonnes of dry matter or on a dry matter basis, you're actually buying it on the ME value that it does. So for example, a lot of grass silage is sold on that. Yeah.
Your hay, I mean, there's hay and there's good hay, good lucerne hay. That hay figure there, is that like a cereal hay you're talking about?
No, standard grass hay. I'll repeat that question for the audience, sir, so they can hear it, because that's a good question. So what we've got down the bottom, and perhaps if I'll get to that in a moment, the question at the bottom was that hay figure seemed, I'll paraphrase, the hay figure seems relatively low. Sometimes there's really good hays and maybe you can get a higher figure, and we'll come back to that in a moment, because that's a good point. And lucerne was mentioned specifically, and that's true. Lucerne is an example of a better quality hay. Even when it's quite fibrous, the ME value of them is relatively high. It's not probably as high as people often think, but it's often 10, and you don't get that to too many other hays. What I did want to say with this one is up the top we've got these grains, and down the bottom we've got the forages in general. So here's my first point that I want you to see about the forages in general. They're all lower. Now you hear some figures and you see some figures about silages in particular, about grass silages in particular. There was a very long-standing competition in the South Island of New Zealand where silages were sent in over many years. And if you won, you got the highest ME silage, you won a prize. It was a very sneaky way of collecting thousands and thousands of samples. And at the end, looking at thousands and thousands of samples of ryegrass and clover silage. Now mind you, this is arguably the best quality ryegrasses on planet Earth, in my humble opinion, that they came from. The average ME value from these silages was 10. So don't get hooked up on this idea that you can make these grass silages and they're high. They're not. They're not. They're typically made for yield when there's quite a lot of fibre in them, and their ME values are typically low. Now, the gentleman down the front talked about lucerne. Lucerne is an excellent feed, no question around that one. And for a higher fibre, which it often does have, somewhere in the middle bracket, it holds that it has a higher energy because that fibre breaks down quite well. It's quite digestible. So lucerne is a good hay, but you still don't get too many of them that are over 10. So if you're talking about hays particularly, or silages are something that there's a lot of information on, you should be very careful about giving them high values. And when you move to straws, you have to accept that that value goes down, down, down. Now, pretty much all of the upright material, the reason that it's upright is it's been held stiff and cylindrical with lots of fibre and often lots of lignin. Now that means it's less digestible, there's less energy involved. So what we see here, for both sides, over here we've got a higher energy and we've got a lower fibre. Over here we've got a lower energy and we've got a higher fibre. All right? So the first thing that we'd say is there is a strong relationship between that fibre, and there's two things that I want to say with it. Number one, that you can look at that and you can get a feel for it, so you can judge for yourself on what the energy value is. And the second thing is that we can use that fibre as a way of working out how much they're likely to eat. So I'm going to give you a couple of rules of thumb today that we can work on, but here's a pretty straightforward one. Stock won't typically eat very much over 1% of what they weigh in fibre. They won't typically eat over that. So that tends to be an upper limit. Now with lactating animals that shifts a little bit, might get to that later. But in general terms, Fred, if you remember that one, you can do your sums. If I'm feeding this and it's very low, I might well have too low fibre. We'll get a little bit on that later. But in general terms, I'm not going to reach my upper limit because of fibre. If I'm feeding straw and it's 75% fibre, I should be quite careful because it's not going to be very long because they're not going to eat anymore, right? Now the final one I want to say with this picture is just to give you something on crude proteins. Again,
1% per day week.
1 day per day, yeah. Sorry, I should have given you that one. 1% of their body weight daily is about their upper limit for most stock. Yeah.
Will you speak about lupins on here as well? Are they something you'll touch on?
I'll get to later. Yeah, I will. Yep.
Jim, a couple of quick questions. The reason why you talk about the upper limit is not because you're suggesting that you want people to feed that upper limit, but because it has such an influence on their capacity to
That's
eat
it.
other stuff. Yeah?
So we're not using that figure to say that's what you should aim for. What we want to get to later is I want to show you, because you can know these figures, that you can know what these energy densities are, you can work out whether you can meet your targets or not pretty easily. Nobody has to do that for you. You can do that. All of you can learn today to do that without too much trouble. But one of the checks in that system is to say, okay, I can get straw really cheap. It's really low in energy value, but I'll just feed more and more of it. Well, no, you won't, because there'll be a limit where they won't eat any more. And I want to give you a tool, a pretty easy tool to say that won't work. And what happens then is I get trouble.
The other question
Yep.
was when you look up there and you think, well, if I was going to go for the highest energy, I'd feed wheat. But we have all these cautions in our mind, even though there are a lot of people feeding wheat at the moment, about acidosis and how we manage that risk. And I know that you're going to talk about transitioning.
Yes.
But is it the higher energy value that causes the risk, or is it something else to do with wheat?
So the question was, if you didn't hear it up the back, for wheat and the risk of acidosis, is it simply because it's a higher energy value? No. The short answer is it's not. The difficulty with acidosis is that the type of energy that's present there is very rapidly released, because in this case it's all in starch. You can have similar issues if you have very high sugar content feeds. There's a ton of them. Citrus pulps are one example that were given over the last little while. If you feed them, you can run into some trouble, and they're nearly all sugar and no starch. So if those carbohydrates in there are rapidly available, then you can run into acidosis. There's some other much higher ME feeds that are based on fats. You don't see them very commonly, but they are. And some occasions they'll be 16, 17 sort of ME, and they have no risk of acidosis. They have other issues, but they have no risk of acidosis. The acidosis risk is simply about carbohydrates, but we'll come practically to that later on. So I think there was a question. So,
feed test done 4 or 5 years ago as hay or straw was made.
yeah,
If it hasn't been eaten, is that test still relevant?
It
or
is.
does
It
so
is.
You don't have to retest it.
yep. So the question, if you didn't hear that at the back, was if you've had a feed test on straw or hays and they're sitting in the shed and they're reasonably well looked after anyway, do they degrade? Does much of that degrade over time? No. That feed test will be pretty similar. If it's some of the higher protein ones, on occasion you can have some silages, for example, you can have some protein degradation. But typically for the energy values, no, they'll be pretty regular. Yeah.
Jim, how do you handle, say, cereal hay that's got grain in it?
With some difficulty. So if what should happen is that when you get a feed test done on, you'll also get a starch. I didn't put it here, but you get a starch content, and typically it'll be adjusted for that. So you should get an ME value that comes out of it that adjusts for that starch value. But as a knockabout rule of thumb for it, you can work out how much is there. And if the proportion is particularly low, it doesn't shift it enough that it makes much difference. And in most cases when it's inadvertent, that's true. There are occasions, for example, I know people have told us the last few meetings that there was some canola that was harvested seed and all. And in that sense, it raises the crude protein right up. It does make a big difference to the feed quality and value for it. But in general terms, your others, no. If it's inadvertent, it doesn't. Yep.
There's a lot of weather damaged grain around this year. I'm guessing the energy and that would be affected, would it? Protein isn't, but...
No, not necessarily. Unless the starch resources are taken, because it's full of starch, and that's why it's such good value for it. Unless those starch resources are used up, so it's starting to germinate and respire and moved up on it, no. There is usually they're registered as a check of a point or so on ME, but they don't make a huge difference on them. They're relatively robust in that. Yeah.
And what about water damaged hay, Jim? Like, so you were talking about 3 years ago I got a feed test and now the hay's been water damaged. How much impact do you think that'll have, Jim?
It has a reasonable impact sometimes on higher protein hays. So if you have, you can have sometimes that'll be effectively functionally washed out. It's not exactly true, but that's how it appears. But in general terms, unless there's some other secondary processes that are going on, it doesn't change very much at all. In terms of its energy supply, the energy supply we're talking about here most of the time in those conserved feeds doesn't have a lot of sugars or starches left if you're talking about the forages. It does, of course, with the grains, but not with the forages. So what happens if you get them wet initially is that they can wash out some of the sugars that do have an energy value. Now, once they're there, after that one, that doesn't change much anymore. And most of the hays at that point have relatively little sugar, so it doesn't make any difference. Righto. Now, we said if we're going to have our energy, we got some choices, and we've got some rankings and things we think about in terms of buying energy. So now I'm going to present some for you for buying protein and fibre. There's a lot of you will be buying protein and fibre, so I'll give you some really easy rules on doing that. And there's 3 of them, and I think all of you can remember these without any trouble. So the first one is that we would buy that protein and fibre on lowest costs. We would buy it on lowest cost, okay? The second one is we would buy the protein and fibre on lowest cost. And the third one is we would buy the protein and fibre on lowest cost. Now, are there any exceptions to that? No. No. Here's... Yeah.
How do you apply your 3 rules?
Well, one moment, I'll come around to this. There's something I want to finish here. Here's where the first part of this is where the witchcraft starts, righto? The moment someone starts talking to you about different protein or special protein or efficient protein or something like that, I want you to put your hand on your wallet as tight as you can, because you're about to be robbed, right? So the first and most important thing to remember with protein and fibre is, unlike energy, where we're making decisions, we are not with them. We are buying it simply on cost. Now there's lots of different suppliers of protein, and we're talking here about true protein, not the non-protein nitrogens we said before. We're talking about protein proper. In those cases, you are buying it on cost. Remember what we said before about the way that ruminants use that protein. Now, unlike us, where it does matter, and you can have different diets and different proteins and better and worse. Unlike us, they don't treat it like that. What they treat it like is a nitrogen source that they can break it down and build it up again. So the first and most important thing to decide around that one is don't spend any more money than you have to. So yeah, it's a good one. So the question down the front here was, how do you then talk about bypass protein? With the carefully would be my answer to you. Carefully, with your hand tightly over your wallet most of the time. So the first thing I'd say is bypass protein is true protein that makes it through the rumen without being broken down and makes its way to the gut. And then it's like our bacon and eggs, is broken down like you and me in the small intestine and used as those building blocks. As a knockabout rule of thumb, unless you're in some extremely high production scenarios, and we're talking about typically about lactating cows who are operating at literages that we don't ordinarily get, in those situations you can make half a case for some good bypass protein making an effect on more production or some impact on the quality of the product coming out there. In general terms, apart from that, bypass protein plays a relatively little role. And you should be really careful about buying protein on the basis that it's going to be different or changed. Particularly if we're talking about drought feeding scenarios exclusively. Be very careful with that. But in normal production systems, remember most of the time that bypass protein only really comes into play if you've got particularly high production systems. Now they're relatively difficult to do on forage-based ones. In feedlots it's slightly different, and in some of the really high production dairy cows you can make half a case for it. But by high production I'm talking the other side of 10,000 litres. It's not standard for it.
Well, it sort of makes sense with your low cost rule when we produce a lot of our own grain, hay and silage. And so when people have been feeding for a while now, they're only starting to buy when they run out of their own stores. So they might be buying firstly from their neighbour who just kept more for one reason or another. So we're very much thinking about value in terms of what's the best feed I can buy in now, you know, carting the last distance. That type of situation, not the feedlot, but the drought lot at home when we're literally just running out of what we've fed.
Okay, so I think we're getting ahead of ourselves there because we've got a few, we'll come to all of that material in a little while. But before we go down that road, I guess the first instance to say is there's a difference in how we buy energy and how we buy protein, and how, for that matter, how we buy fibre. And for energy, there's some other decisions to be made, but for protein, the one you should be thinking of is which is the cheapest. Now remember what we said, energy is our dominant, protein is a distant second, and what we really want to do with that one is just to say which is our cheapest protein source. There is very little difference, particularly in difficult scenarios like most of you are facing now, in terms of the protein that you buy. So you hear these bits and pieces like, oh, this one's more digestible or this one's special. Actually, most proteins are very digestible. The overwhelming bulk of them are over 90%. So they're very digestible. So there's relatively little that you can do in those circumstances to move this one. We will come around to some specifics on dietary feeding and how you're making the decision on your whole diet in a little while, but I'll truck through on what I want to finish with this. These are the things that you should be very careful that you're not buying protein or fibre on. So there was some special, a while back there was some groups, one group in particular, it doesn't matter who they are, and they were in Australia but not so much. They were quite strong in New Zealand for a while, then they went bankrupt and left. But what they were doing is that they were explaining that they had this special machine, and it would take your fibre, your wheat straw fibre, and it would do magic with it. it would do magic, and it would cut it in a special way. So it wasn't just normal fibre anymore, it was special fibre, and this would have some great effect inside the rumen. Remember what we said? Energy in, energy out. It was saying, while they're in there, you have this great effect, it happens in here, and it does something special, and you wring a little bit more out of the lemon, and you get all these efforts on it. Here's my advice to you. Whenever people start talking about magic in ruminant nutrition, put your hand over your wallet very firmly, because they're about to rob you. And then I look at it another way. Whenever people start saying this one, you've been gifted a sign from heaven, right? Get that person off the farm as quick as you can, right? Because everything they tell you after that will cost you money, right? Everything. Right? Get them off as quick as you can, right? It's a sign from heaven. So these are the ones that you don't want to be doing. For protein and fibre in particular, you don't want to be involved with them. I'm not going to spend too much time on the genetics this one because I think it's probably covered as well by the DPI themselves, and there's good material around this one. But I do want to make one point with this. Having talked about energy, having talked about protein in that decision and fibre to a limited extent, when you come around to making the next choice is, what am I going to feed and what am I not going to feed? There's a seesaw balance that comes into play with this one. And it's around deciding between cash flow, really, and the genetics that you want to save when you intervene. So it's already been discussed a little, and the concept has been mentioned. And it runs like this. Your purchase of energy in situations, drought situations in particular, you're buying it in. So we're going to look in a moment at maintenance values that you've got to work on for these different stock classes. But here's something that's real. The lighter that they get, the lower their maintenance is, right? Their maintenance reflects their live weight. So if I'm moving from 80 kilos to 60 kilos, I'm changing your bill every day because you're buying that in, you're buying that energy in. And just to keep them at that weight and to keep them alive, there's a shift as you move down. So you could put one side of it is, I'm going to save money if I'm going to do that. But the other side of it is to say, well, how far do you go down there before you intervene? And that really is the decision that you have to make. And I would suggest to you that there's a couple of things. If indeed you're keeping them at a very high level, then you can make the case that that's probably not cost effective. But generally, when the wheels fall off at the other side, the price for having done that too late becomes a salvage issue. And usually it's worse. So while it is true that you can be too good, it's more commonly true that you're too late. And by the time you intervene on those ones, there's a whole series of downstream consequences, which we're not going to speak much about today, that suggest that you should have done that earlier and held it there. Now remember, in the end, that's just an energy calculation. It's a price calculation, but it's really just an energy calculation that you're buying in there. But it is something that you have to think about in terms of production feeding in dry times. Okay, now we're going to go over some metabolizable energy targets. So what this is on a daily basis, for those same units of energy that we spoke about before, what do we need and how does this change? So we'll do sheep first, then we'll do cattle. So what we're going to look at pretty simply, we're going to standardise this for a ewe, around about 50 kilo ewe, and we're going to make it for the lamb, not standing still, but for going forward at about 50 grams a day. So it's not just holding these, the lambs are still going forward. So the first thing I want to say for this is that you can see that there's a difference between strictly between no fetus and no lactation involved, and including the fetus and including lactation. Now, the first thing that you should see for that one is that lactation is an energy expensive enterprise. If you're producing more milk, you are pulling a whole lot more energy out of the system, and you have to supply that into the system if you're doing it. That lactation demand for milk, which is reflected in your weaning weights, is a very energy expensive one. So what we can say here is this is a figure that you can think through. So let's just use an exercise. Let's just say you're on cereal stubble, and we'll go back to our straw being 6 units of ME per kilogram of dry matter. All right, let's use the upper limit just for the purposes of this. I'm now saying that they're going to eat 1.5 kilos of straw. Hands up anybody who believes that that's going to happen. Nobody. Right? So if I'm looking at this one, then I can make some decisions about that energy density, can't I? I can make some decisions about whether that's an appropriate feed for me to meet my target. And what also did we say? As a knockabout rule of thumb, they're only going to eat about 1%, a little bit more, And dry, it's true, lactation, it wobbles a little bit on that one, but as a knockabout rule of thumb, that 1% isn't too far away. So I could think about my straw, let's say it's 75%, so 750 grams of fibre for every kilogram that I feed. Well, automatically I'm going to be in some trouble, aren't I? I'm probably not going to do it. So what I'm saying to you is, there's a really easy way for you to have a quick look at this feed and go, they're probably not going to eat that much. This is how much I need them to do, but if I'm trying to feed them that, they're probably not going to eat that much. It's not complicated, it's not especially difficult to do, and you can do it. We'll put down the lambs here, and that's a good example. If you want them moving forward, it depends on their size, of course, so we have quite a bracket for those ones, but if I want them moving forward, like we said, there still has to be a pretty strong input into those lambs if I want them to do that. If I want them to keep going for that size, there's a strong input. Now with a much lighter body weight, I have to be much more careful about the energy density of that feed, because if it's a low energy density, there's no way they're going to eat that much. There's no way they're going to be able to pull that in. So I have to be careful about the form that I buy that energy in that I'm going to feed to them. So if we move to cattle, similar concept. So what we're going to do here for steers, we're going to say 400 kilogram growing steers, moving forward about half a kilo a day. So if it's going well and you wanted to do it, that's probably about right. So you can see we're cheating a little bit by calling this their maintenance, because it's not. Typically it's including this live weight gain, but what we're saying for those steers is that we've got about 65 units. I'll give you another easy rule of thumb. Most of the time, cattle in particular, sheep are slightly different, but cattle are easy for you to do. Their maintenance value will normally hold between 10 and 15% of their live weight. So their maintenance energy requirement will normally be it'll be mostly when it hits 400 or 500 kilos, it'll be about dead on 12 in the middle. But it'll always hold between 10 and 15% of their maintenance, of their live weight I should say, their maintenance value. So if we looked at this for a 400 kilo steer, we could say if it was 10%, it was 40. If it was 15%, it was 60. Most of the time in good weather, it'll be somewhere in the middle if they're grazing, right? It'll be holding around that one, and then for 500 grams, there's a cost in energy to put that on. What I'm pointing out here is, you can do these sums yourselves. There's nothing difficult. You can look at these tables, you can make some decisions on them. There's nothing magical or spooky about doing these. They're pretty straightforward. Well, let's use this steer as an example here. We're going to go back to our wheat straw. Does anybody believe that this steer at 400 kilos can eat 11 kilos of wheat straw to get that sort of energy input? Never. Now you can work that out for yourself. You can work it out on that fibre rule we said. You can work it out on some others too, but either way you realise I'm going to have to make some decisions if that's what I want in that diet. Now the only other thing I want to say for here is that the energy value required for dry cows is quite low. And clearly many of you will know that they've often got body reserves further north in the dry seasons. They tend to go up and down, and their body reserve losses can be very strong in that dry season. Cows normally are adaptable. Growing stock aren't, and if you do that, you impact on meat quality and a whole lot of other things. But for dry cows, they are pretty flexible. But if you're looking at holding condition or putting on condition, then that figure there you have to be quite careful with. And again, depending on what you want, you have to make some decisions about, are they likely to eat all of that? You notice also that when we go up to pregnancy, as a knockabout rule of thumb, the early parts of pregnancy don't add very much, but the last 3 months, it adds on average about 20 units of ME a day. So it's sort of 10, 20, then 30, so on average it's about 20 units a day. So on top of our dry one, if it's in pregnancy, we're adding about that unit a day. Or if we were talking about our wheat straw, do we really think that that extra 20 is going to be 3 kilos, 3 and a bit kilos of wheat straw? Probably not. So again, you can make that decision. You can look at this and think, I'm not going to get there. This is the last one I'm going to give you, and you don't get tested on this on the way out the door, I promise, but this is the last one I'm going to give you, and we'll talk about protein. So, and fibre, but protein's the one I really want you to look at. So the first line here, we've got cattle and sheep. The first line's a protein, and the second line's fibre. First line's protein for sheep, second line's fibre. All right, so what we're going to say for this, if we've got growing animals, steers and lambs, now there's some very high protein figures that are given for this. Now, Tim put up before some early weaning. Just to note that, early weaning does have a very high protein requirement because you're taking them when they would normally be getting a good protein supply from the ewe or the cow, right? So early weanings are different. They often are very high crude proteins. But as a knockabout rule of thumb, if you've got these and they're moving forward for the targets that you want for good growing steers, so feedlot targets, for example, are still there or thereabouts at 12%. And for lambs, because they're smaller, their body weight's smaller, they do actually have a higher percentage protein requirement. Again, that knockabout figure is about 15%. Now here's the thing I want you to say. With more protein, I don't get more responses. Okay, so I want you to be really clear on it. If some is good, more is not better, right? And protein is by far the most expensive component of what you'll buy in. So you buy it in, you waste it because they urinate it out, right? Helps nobody. The other side of this is also true. Protein requirements are real, but when you come down underneath them, you don't drop off a cliff. So you don't go from, all right, I can't make my 12%, I'm only on 11, I'm not going to grow at all now, I've stopped, I've given up. It doesn't work like that. What happens is it's a slow ride down. Now there is a protein percentage in the diet because there is a requirement in the rumen to have some nitrogen for the bugs to work. And if you drop under that one, then there is a cliff. But that's a very low figure typically, 6% or so for adult cattle. Now there's not a lot of growth and other bits and pieces around that one, but the rumen will be functioning. My colleagues up in Queensland, where I'm from, rib me regularly about my New Zealand bias now with protein, saying I'm always too high because they live their whole lives on 6% crude protein, growing out various cows and breeding stock and finishing animals. So just to be sure on this one, more of it doesn't help you, less of it isn't automatically a problem, and many times, sometimes you'll be forced into less of that because you just won't be able to make it fit. The other point that I notice is for cattle, that it increases a little with pregnancy, but not an awful lot. Between growing and pregnancy, not an awful lot. There's quite a lot of work, of course, these days, and has been now for the last 15 years, specifically on dairy. So it's for 100 reasons that becomes quite pointy for them. What's the minimum protein requirement if I want to reduce nitrogen losses in the system? What's the minimum protein requirement to have healthy, happy animals and progeny after that? And over the years, it's been falling. And in certain countries where there's a lot of restrictions, the Netherlands is the best example, it's been falling rapidly down to what this is. And there's a real consensus around that figure of 11 and 12%. And when we go to lactation, we're not talking about dairy lactation here, we're talking about beef lactation. You can see it lifts up. There's a higher protein requirement, but remember again, if you're underneath that one, you don't drop off a cliff. You just reduce. You reduce milk, you reduce weaning weights after that. Note the second one, and this is I'll leave it with the fibre. I'm going to say this one. It'll be very rare for most of you to have a forage system that ever has a fibre content that's under 35. For some years I've had a running wager. No one's ever taken me up on it. Well, they have, but they never paid out, to be fair. That I bet people a beer that you won't show me a feed test that has less than 35%. Now I'll give you a hint. If you want to beat me on this one, go and look at some of the growing cereals. If you get them at the right time, you can park them lower. You can get them down that a little bit. You'll drop them down into the 30 zones, but not very much. Now, putting them aside, most of the other forages you feed will always have enough fibre. Grains, though, we saw before, often won't. So you remember what we said with grains, their fibre was in the teens most of the time. So in cattle in particular, that shows up. In sheep, that's less of a problem. I think we'll cover that more in questions later rather than doing that now. And the figure for sheep, for optimal healthy fibre for sheep, is lower again. In fact, I'm being very conservative with that figure. Often it's well underneath that figure that people are working on in practice. So I'm going to wrap this up now. First thing I'll say for this one, right on your mirror when you go home, it's energy and it's intake. The moment you take your eyes off those two, your production and your profitability is moving. It's not magic. It's not making something, tweaking or be efficient or spending money and time on that. No. It's spending sensible inputs on energy and making sure that you maximise your intake. And that doesn't matter if you're in dry times or if you're in good times, that concept stays the same. Second one is that you should think about buying it on ME. You should look at the ME value of this and think about carefully how you're purchasing that one. Because sometimes there's a real mismatch on that. Not always, but usually it reflects that. But sometimes there's a real mismatch and you need to be careful with it. Cereals recommend themselves most of the time because they're energy dense and there's plenty of them around, and historically in Australia they've been cheap. But as that price starts to jack up, you should think carefully because it isn't always the lowest cost means of buying energy. You need to review that, you need to look at it pretty carefully when you're making those purchases. And what we've said down here, I'll hold to. You don't make money out of feeding for beef, you don't make money out of finishing them on hays or silages. Don't let anyone tell you any different on that. You know, they'll go forward, there's no question around it, but in the scheme of things, for the price of things, it's a very slow finishing, it's a high fibre finishing. Typically, they're not cost effective. They're decent feeds to hold condition, they're decent feeds for slow, in dry times, if that's all you've got, for slow condition gains, there's no question around it. But in terms of finishing on it, a very difficult proposition to put, simply because of the fibre that's involved in there. Nearly always way too high, and will limit that intake. I'm going to talk about one exception, having spent all this time telling you that, that really it's energy, energy, energy and everything else. At the moment, in your situation, there's a number of people who've got a standing feed. Now, it might be a very poor quality, might be cereal stubbles, might be what's left for some leftover paddocks that you've held that are pretty stalky and dry and had it. Now, here is one thing. They will typically be very fibrous, number one. So we're not talking about a maximum optimised production system, we're not. We're talking about using them in a dry time effectively, or as effectively as we can. What they will almost always not have is much protein. They'll always be low in protein. Now, some of you might have known or seen or worked in the Downs country in Queensland and further north. There's a lot of a grass called Mitchell grass. Now, Mitchell grass is outside of a narrow window in its growing season. It's a spectacularly low nutritive value grass. It's like a beer carton half the time. You know, the ME value on it is awful, worse than cereal straw. Yet historically, steers that have been put on it will do pretty well, and they were always known to do pretty well. So there was quite a lot of work that was done to try and work out what was going on. So there's an introduced tropical legume up there called Stylosanthes, which some of you may be familiar with, like a little, maybe one way to describe it, like a little cactus without spines. And cattle really like it, and they seek it out, and it's everywhere, and they seek it out and eat it. So what they do is they get a pretty good protein supply independent of the Mitchell grass that they're grazing on. And what happens is they eat more and more of the Mitchell grass. Now, I did some of this work, University of Queensland, almost 20 years ago, looking at this with Mitchell grass. And what we were doing is we're putting the hay out, terrible quality hay by order. If I remember rightly, it came off the Longreach airfield, so there you go, but it was many years ago. Terrible quality, worse than a beer carton probably, and we put it out and let them eat as much as they want, and we'd measure it. And then what we began to do was put in increments of cottonseed meal, and we increased their total diet fourfold just by supplying protein. So what happened is I just supplied the protein with it, and they would then eat more and more and more. Now, in many cases, you can take the same approach, and I'm going to add one more thing with this. When you're feeding that protein, one of the quirks of protein, unlike energy, is that you don't necessarily have to feed it every day. So nitrogen has a longer cycle in ruminants. So they don't automatically take it in and pee it out every day. They don't. They can hold that in their system. Now, there's been a tremendous amount of work done in tropical environments looking at what the frequency of protein feeding is to get good results. Now, some of that early work was on protein concentrates. Some of that work was on molasses and urea. And in recent times, or more recent times, it was on leukina, which is a tree legume some of you might be familiar with. Grows like stink, and they can graze it straight off the tree. Doesn't have a very high nutritive value except for protein. Lots of protein in it. And what they were demonstrating was if they gave them on poor quality pastures, if they gave them the opportunity to graze 3 times a week or every day, was there a big shift in their live weight gains? And the truth was, there wasn't much shift at all. So another way of putting this is that you can use proteins sporadically. So it reduces the cost of those proteins going out because they're expensive, and it also reduces your labour and hassle and everything else. So sometimes a way of using a feed base that you've got there is to put this protein in episodically a few times a week. And I think in questions we might take up some specific ways that you can do that in the region. And that's our summary, and I think we've said most of those ones. So remember, it's intake. Go home and write it on your mirror. It's intake. If you want production, more production, has my intake gone up today? My management the last week, did it increase intake or did it decrease intake? Because you can do both. Sometimes without thinking about it, sometimes without knowing it. Did I increase intake? Because almost always if I did, I'll increase production. Note, in dry times, particularly when feeds are really expensive, I could get all of you to have marvellous intakes and most of you would go broke. Right? You don't necessarily make more money out of that if you're buying all that feed in. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the concept of nutrition that underlies that. You'd have to be careful with that, but the concept underneath it is there's no magic involved in the rumen, it's just intake. We said protein's important, but remember, more is not better. Once you get to that line, you're just paying it for nothing. So you want to be careful and you want to be thoughtful about how you're putting that in, particularly when you're buying all of it there. These other ones have a role, and we've had some of it described and it's important, but remember, if you're majoring on them, you're probably losing productivity and profitability. They are by far less important. In every way, by far, they're less important. And what we've said here is think about buying ME on that and use the protein supplements carefully, because you can do better with them or you can do worse with them, but at the moment in your special circumstances, I think they represent a real opportunity. And I'm going to leave it at that and open it up for questions at this point.
Lupin.
Okay, we'll get to lupins, sir. Yeah.
Assuming it's going to rain at some point.
Tomorrow apparently. Yeah.
Do you have any tricks for activating the rumen to transfer from a high grain diet over to fresh green feed?
No, and there aren't any, to be honest. So if you didn't hear that question, that's a good one. So you've been on lots of grain for a while, and then it's going to rain sometime. There's going to be some grass that comes up, and you know what do you do to transition the rumen over? You know, the best transition, the best way to transition the rumen is to feed it. You know, that's the simple facts of the matter. There's always an adaptation period if you're moving from one feed to another. There always is. Sometimes it's very quick. Sometimes it'll be 48, 72 hours. Sometimes it's slow. So the transition and adaptation onto grain, for example, should be at least a week, 10 days a week, if you're getting them up to high grain layers. And there's a whole series of different things that come into play. So sometimes there are animal health issues, like if you've got grains, or so the starches in grains or the sugars in citrus pulp, etc. like that. When you're adapting that rumen, you're to a small extent changing the bugs in the rumen. To a large extent, you're changing the rest of the physiology around that. They've got to absorb more water, or they've got to change the rumen environment. There's a whole lot of things that happen. If you don't see animal health issues with them, mostly that production is not going to be a problem, because they do it reasonably promptly, and you trying to intervene to do it quicker or slower normally won't change much. I would say one thing though, because it's slightly to one side of this as a transition issue. If you have rain and you have a sudden flush of grass, there are some reasonably stern animal adaptations that take place when you've got really low dry matter feed. And there's often a lot of confusion around this, because what's confused is people will say it's a fibre issue. So I'm speaking from experience in New Zealand. We've got very low dry matter grasses, and we use a lot of very low dry matter crops. One of the crops that we feed a lot of, fodder beet, the total dry matter of this for these animals that are on maximum intakes and maximum live weight gains is 11%. So it's very low. You know, they live their whole lives, some of these, on under 15%. When you're moving them onto them, there is a long adaptation period to being able to eat lots of water. And it's sometimes confused when people are saying they need more fibre. No, not necessarily. In fact, commonly not. What they do need is a reasonable extended period of time to get used to trucking through a lot of that water. So to answer your question on that one, the only way that you can have that done effectively is to keep them on it, and to keep them on it for a longish period of time. In that changeover period, if you put them straight on, say that you held that paddock up, got good grass, and you put them on, what you'd expect is that you'd have a pretty strict and straightforward reduction in intake when you went on, because they'd have to adapt to it. So if you wanted to avoid that, you've got to lower that water load on them. And the easiest way to do that is to continue to feed some dry feed. Now that dry feed can be grain. It doesn't have to be hay or straw or fibre. If you do, you'll reduce the intake, of course. So it doesn't have to be a fibre source, because it's not a fibre issue most of the time. Usually it's a water issue. So that's the possible exception. But I guess I'd encourage you most of the time, the easiest way to adapt the rumen, feed it. You know, you feed it. You feed it. You don't have to do anything else special on it. Just feed it. It comes around.
So just further to that, feeding lupins prior to putting them on green would get that rumen bacterial changeover happening?
No, not necessarily. I mean, lupins have got a reasonable energy source, and they're a great protein source. So there's nothing negative about feeding them. But in terms of them adapting them to a low dry matter feed, minimal effect, really. It's not about the rumen bacteria, it's about the rest of the animal most of the time. I'll give you one example, just to push that one there. If you have adult cattle, so it's common for us to feed 500 kilo steers as a finishing diet on fodder beet, for example, and it can be 11%. If you do your sums, they're often eating 10 kilograms of dry matter, and it's only 10 or 11%. So if you add the amount of water that they're eating every day, it's 80 or 90 litres of water that they're eating every day. Now, as they go up in their intake, they have to adapt to be able to pee all that water out. So it takes a process for them to get up. Now, you can add all the fibre you want, doesn't change any of that. If you want to get them to full intakes, they have to adapt the rest of their body to be able to do it. And once they adapt it, they stay on it for months and months and months. So, you know, there's no shift that you can do that'll speed that up, or there's no potion or anything that you can do. You just feed them. Yeah. Lupins. Sorry.
Yeah, do you feed them in New Zealand?
Effectively, no. They have some high country use where they're used on, say, merinos right up in, almost in the alpine ones for a short season, because they're pretty hardy and they grow on really poor soils a lot of the time. But beyond that, but lupin feeding in Australia we're familiar with, so lots of. So was there a specific question around?
Oh no, just how valuable are in this part of the world? I mean, you had $400 a tonne. Barley might be 300 or 330 at the moment or something.
Yep.
But you go and if you were trial feeding, you trial feed out lupins, they'll eat. I know there's too much protein in them. You won't find a lupin left behind.
Yeah.
And you lose a percentage of trial feeding any other grain.
Yeah, it's true.
So that would equalise, you know, the cost.
So you've pretty much covered the whole of the answer in that question. I don't think I can beat that. I hope you all heard it in the background. I do. I agree entirely. So the points were in order. Say for lupins, they're not only a really good protein source, but they're actually a really good energy source. So the only thing that holds them up as a feed is the fact that typically they hold a higher value, and you can make the case that they're not always necessarily cost effective to do that. What the gentleman in the front said was, well, you know, the utilisation for lupins on ground feeding is really high. You know, functionally close to 100%. There's not much that's left behind. Whereas you're feeding out most of the grains, it can be very high in dry conditions, but it's not quite as high. So you know that cost you have to take into account. I think at the moment the figures that I'm given for grains are still around 300 a tonne. So if you're looking at 300 or 400 a tonne, you've got to have 75% utilisation to make up with that, don't you? You've got to have a pretty big shift in terms of energy. What lupins are very effective with in grain rations, though, are balancing up that protein. So some of those grains, for example, oats is a good example, not particularly high in energy, not particularly high in protein. So judicious use of some lupins mixed in with them is a very effective way to raise that crude protein to the target level that you want to use. Pretty hard to make an argument against those ones. So the only thing that stops lupins being in common use for that is just price. So if you're constructing least cost rations around that one, hey, I'm all for them. They're a very sensible way to go about them. I mean, there's a lot of folk, probably in this audience, there'd be a lot of folk who are using them just like that, have been for a long time, and are using them very effectively. So, no difficulty at all.
You were talking about palm kernels, wasn't it?
Palm kernel, yeah.
They feed in New Zealand. What's the cost economic
Yeah.
value of them compared with grain?
So palm kernel's a very interesting feed. I'll give you a little background on this one, because I think New Zealand imports more of it than anyone in the world. So up in Malaysia and in sort of Southeast Asia, they grow palm plantations for palm oil. Now, palm oil's a massive international commodity. I think everything you eat has palm oil in it. Every shampoo, it's used for everything palm oil. And so there's a great market for palm oil, and they've progressively torn down more forest, which gets the greenies hopping. And so if you go home and Google palm oil and read about it, you see pictures of orangutans, and they've got no habitat left and all this. Well, when they squeeze out the palm oil from this, the stuff that's left is this sort of brown meal. And I mean, it's a reasonable protein, sometimes 15%, so it's right up there. And depending how they get the oil out, one way they get the oil out is like a cold squeeze. And in that one, pretty much like canola, you don't get all the oil out, it stays, and there's quite high lipid content. So that means it's a pretty high energy content feed. There's another palm kernel extract that's solvent extracted, has next to no lipid at all, and that one's a very different feed, quite low nutritive value. But the one that comes into New Zealand is the cold pressed one with a reasonable high lipid level. So New Zealand the last few years has imported 1 million tonnes a year. And the positives about palm kernel are it's really cheap. So when grains were the 300 there or thereabouts, palm kernel was 180 a tonne. And realistically, it's a byproduct. So if nobody fed a mouthful of palm kernel, again, it wouldn't change one bit of forest being pulled down or stopped, or it's not. Palm oil is the game, and this is a byproduct. And in plenty of places, what they do, right on our border, unbelievably, what they do is to burn it. You know, they burn this palm, and which it doesn't help anybody. So I've always wondered why Australia doesn't bring a lot of it in, because it's a marvellous feed. You know, some people are a bit negative on it. I'm not. I think it's a positive feed for palm kernel, and I'm not paid by some palm kernel guy, by the way, just so you know. But you know, I've always wondered why we don't use more of it here, because it comes in big ships. They fill it up, these massive ships, pock it out. It's, you know, it's pretty cheap, and effectively it's a byproduct for them that's given away for very little. So I think we should probably use more of it. The positive about palm kernel too, we said before, with storing it, it's really bomb-proof. You know, it stores really well, it lasts ages. You put it out in the paddock in a trailer, from day one they all sort of half like it, then they get onto it and they quite like it, but there's no animal health issues at all. They can't OD on it, they can't do anything else. It's a pretty sort of solid feed. I'll answer any other questions, but there's another feed I wanted to talk about that's around here that might be of value. Did I see a question over there though?
Yeah, 4 or 5 slides back, you had that fibre, detergent, neutral fibre.
Yep.
And there was significant difference between corn or maize and oats.
Yeah.
But their energy and their protein are pretty much the same.
Yeah.
So, could you maybe, do you treat them nearly as the same grain, or does
so corn grain would normally have a higher energy than oats. There's no question around it. In fact, some people would argue with some of the corn grain that it would be higher than the value that I've given you again. One thing that differs with the way that the energy is available, oats and sorghum are good examples, and corn slightly less so, is the way that starch is wrapped up in the grain and how available it is to the animal quickly. So corn's a safer diet than wheat because it's slower to get that out, and you fall down through oats and sorghum more and more so, they're slower to get them out. It's a pretty good, corn grain is a pretty good energy source, evidenced by the fact that, you know, most of the feedlots in North America are on corn grain and corn silage. I mean, there's no question around that. It's a very effective energy source and a reasonably safe feed. In terms of the fibre within the grain, you know, mostly for those cereal grains, except for oats and sorghum, there isn't a tremendous, super important difference. Some years ago, there was a fad for a little while to say that, you know, wheat had a special NDF. Whenever you hear the word special, put your hand on your wallet, quick as you can, all right, quick as you can. And there was this fad for a while to say that wheat had a special NDF and it broke down different and did this and that. Actually, the fibre component of cereal grains is really not the important component. The important component of that is the starch and the energy that it supplies.
So would it be double oats, maize?
In energy?
Energy and yes.
No, it wouldn't. I mean, you'd be moving, like, the maximum values that you see, and I don't believe them, are up at sort of 12 or so for that. Most of them are considered to be, you know, underneath that. And so you're talking about maybe at best a 30-40% increase over oats. Yeah.
So it means it would provide 30% more energy than a kilo of oats.
Yes.
When you talk about oats, they've got to be brown oats that are low in lignin. Otherwise, if you're talking about white oats, echidna, mortlock, or some of those ones, which they discovered years ago, are high in lignin. So they have to come from the Yarran, the Kuba.
And this is a hybrid that we use because sometimes they'll be a bit mixed. But even if you get
the massive difference.
Well, there is, but it doesn't really matter. The best oats that you can get will always have more fibre than wheat, for example. I mean, that's the issue. They'll always have less energy supply and they'll always have more fibre. Well, I'm not arguing with you that. What I'm saying was, no matter how you work it with oats, no matter where you go with it, the best of them you can get are still not going to be the value of the better cereal grains. They're not.
So wheat and oats are a pretty good mix then?
Yeah. Well, one positive about oats going in for cereals and going out at the moment is that they're a pretty safe feed. You know, they're a higher fibre feed, so they're a pretty safe feed. They don't have the same bang that wheat does, for example, and that's what a lot of people are using. So mixing them and holding some lupins or something, or peas or fava beans or something else to increase that protein at the same time can be a very effective mix. I mean, there's a lot of guys who are using barley and oats at the moment in this broader region. Over the last few days, a number of people have come and talked to me around that. So yeah. Oh yeah?
The past 3 months I've been feeding barley and I've been adding something called Converter 40, and you're telling me I'm actually doing my dough because it's not this neither a protein or an energy source and it's very expensive.
Yes. So as a knockabout rule of thumb, well, I'll put it like this: you can very effectively use straight grain mixes. You can very effectively use them. The important components about using grain carefully are making sure that it's reasonable quality so it's palatable. So that's one of the issues. And then the second one is you transitioning them, adapting them to that feed really well, and having good management the way that you feed it, so you're not giving them surprises or radical changes and bits and pieces like that. I would say, in most cases, the additives add nothing. The additives that you put on, if you've got good management, you've done all those other things well, they're not a requirement. Now, Tim spoke earlier about calcium and phosphorus. Most of the cereal grains have a reasonably high phosphorus and relatively low calcium. If you're on high drought feeding, high grain feeding systems, about 1% lime is a good way to correct that calcium and phosphorus ratio, because typically what you'll have is that the lime has lots of calcium and you're going to need that to get that calcium phosphorus ratio back to about 2 to 1. So lime as an additive is a sensible way to do it, and that's commonly done if you're feeding lots of grain and putting that out for it. Pre-lambing, mostly you want to feed another supply, so if you're not mixing that lime with them at that 1%, what's done quite a lot around here is putting out lime, coarse mag and salt in loose licks that they can go to. Again, a sensible, straightforward way to do it. You should have that calcium going out for it because it's cheap and easy. You should have that magnesium going out. They typically aren't necessarily magnesium deficient, particularly in drought feeding, because you're not no green feed, so you're not feeding them a lot of high potassium feeds mostly, you're not interfering with that. But then most of you will know that magnesium is what drives all of the hormonal systems that pull calcium from the bones. If you have really poor magnesium, that calcium system can't work. So having magnesium out before lambing is a really positive thing to do, and no reason not to. Cause mag, again, is really cheap, really easy to use. So from my perspective, they add nothing to it. They add nothing to the system.
Do they improve the conversion rate?
Now there's a hot one for you. My first answer is have a good look at the research data. Wherever people have put that in front of you, have a good close look at the research data. Because in highly industrialised systems all around the world where that's done, there are a couple of additives, and only a couple of additives, that are typically used on high grain rations. The rest of them aren't. So, you know, in general terms, be very, very careful when you're spending your money on any of those products. Yeah.
Escalin used to be available to put on your wheat or...
Yeah.
Is there anything equivalent on the market now?
So Escalin was virginiamycin, which was an antibiotic, and Europe canned that many, many years ago. And the idea with that was that if you fed this antibiotic, you selectively changed some of the rumen bacteria and tilted it away from rumen acidosis products, or on occasion tilted it towards positive rumen acids that gave you some production benefits. In general terms for sheep, and the way that most of you folk would be feeding it, I don't believe that there's any demonstrated benefit whatsoever. So my suggestion to you would be, don't put another one in, feed it well. You know, along the lines of what we said to the gentleman before you, feed it well. Have good adaptation systems that you're onto, have good quality, make sure that you make the calcium phosphorus ratio on high grade feeding as possible. There is an issue around fibre that you have to address if it's lamb feed lotting, but if it's sort of ewes that you're working through, then some access to fibre is better than none. There are systems that don't use very much at all, but some access is better than none, no question around it. In terms of the rest of the additives, no. No. So if you're asking what the equivalent would be that you should add, I'd add good management rather than anything that you put in with it.
And on that point, it's time for hair and makeup, Jim.
Well, that won't take long. So,
and our first question.
Yeah, open up for questions, go for your life.
We've got this chap here, I promised you.
You touched on urea earlier on.
Yeah.
What part will it play in a...
Okay, so I'll just repeat the question for the rest of the audience in the video. What role does urea have in, I guess, drought feeding and production feeding maybe in general? So what we said before was that ruminants can use non-protein nitrogen sources and they can use them well. And so in theory, you can feed them no protein, you can only feed them urea and get production out of them. In fact, the celebrated example of that back in 1928 was a Finnish researcher who had an accidental rumen fistula and from a bloat case and put a wooden block in there, and it was a milking cow, and he milked this cow for some months without feeding it at all, by pushing newspaper into the rumen as its energy source to digest for fibre and pouring urea in. So, you know, no protein at all, newspaper and urea. Don't do that at home. And for the camera, I'm not advocating a new feeding system in New South Wales. All right. But the point, and you probably wouldn't do that now. Now, it didn't milk very well, but it milked. And I guess that they were demonstrating at that time that that can be a completely non-protein nitrogen source. Now, in further north in Australia, and Australia really led most of this work, to be fair, over many, many years. In Queensland in particular, in the Territory, the development of that MU8, so molasses and urea at 8%. So the molasses was used as the carrier, urea was put in it, and sometimes with salt to stop them having too much on it, was a drought feeding and sort of emergency feeding specialty. What's been demonstrated with that over many years was that it's rarely able to increase production. So it's a good holding approach, but it's usually a very poor production approach. If you look at the feedlot systems, particularly in North America, where they're very aggressive feedlot systems, they'll almost always include a small amount of urea in that ration. And the idea with that is that they're artificially bolstering the protein, but they're still providing proteins because there's some value as they're on their way to being smashed up. Some of those smaller proteins feed bacteria and other bits and pieces as well. So how do you use that in a drought situation? You can use it as one way with molasses if it's cost effective. I don't have a good feel for the price of molasses directly in this region here. We'll get back to that. But if it's cost effective, you can use molasses as the energy source, or at least the highly available fermentable energy source, and urea as the nitrogen source, and you can keep production moving forward. You almost always in those circumstances have to have some fibre as well. So typically what happens is you've got a pasture base of a really poor quality, and you're using the molasses and the urea as a way of sort of supplementing and bolstering that forward. It's not a positive production approach, it's a holding or emergency approach.
So you can't mix it in with your grain, trickle off a little bit.
Well, they do in total mixed rations. They do mix urea in. Typically, it'll be at a low level. So I guess there's two things to say. I presume it's sheep you're talking about? Yeah. So number one is that urea is quite bitter, and so they can select that out. If you're not careful, they can select that out without any trouble at all if you're putting it in as the normal granules for that. Number two, urea poisoning is a very real issue. So if you give them too much in general, or if you adapt them poorly to the amount that you're giving them, urea is converted to ammonia very, very quickly in the rumen, and that ammonia can be blown out of the rumen. It affects their brain and other systems, and you can get catastrophic losses with that. So urea feeding is always done with good management and very carefully. So we'd probably need to talk about that quite specifically if you needed to do it. But the concept of it, you can do it, you can mix it in. Sometimes in the grain systems, instead of going in as urea granules, which are bitter and can be selected out, you can put it as a solution and have a spray that goes across them. And that can work quite well. That's been done plenty of times. There's a limit to that. Remembering those grains, a lot of what you use, they'll bounce between maybe 9 and 13% crude protein, so you're not going to be far off the mark with a lot of them anyway. So you don't need to have an awful lot of urea going into that system. Does that answer the question?
Yep. What about special considerations with urea as the growing stock? Should you really just not use it at all?
Oh no, not necessarily. I mean, there's two parts to that question. I'll repeat the question for the rest of you. What about urea and young stock and special considerations? Should you flag it? In normal circumstances, short of lot feeding, what urea really does in lot feeding is it provides a very fast form of available nitrogen for the bugs to use immediately, while they've got a very fast form of fermentable carbohydrates in the form of starch. So they can marry the two up very quickly, and the idea is that you can get some extra microbial production out of that. Okay, fair enough. In a normal environment outside of lot feeding, the only times that you're significantly going to use urea are in emergency situations or drought feeding situations. And in those cases, between young stock and older stock, there's no great argument in their use in that particular environment. Urea has to be used carefully. I mean, there's some celebrated cases. I'm aware I've got the camera on me, so I'm not going to tell you half of them, but there's some celebrated cases of urea poisoning. They'd make your hair curl. And, it can be done easily, very easily, when people make minor mistakes around decimal points and bits and pieces. It can have some trouble. Certainly the molasses urea mixes in the early days when they were working their way through them, there were some significant issues with them too. But by and large, they're a pretty safe approach now, young stock or adult mature stock. So,
The addition of salt in a drought ration, is that just to make it more palatable, or is it a necessary requirement?
okay. Question for down the front was the addition of salt in drought feeding. Is it a genuine requirement, or is it to make it more palatable? And I'll add one more to it. What it sometimes does is it's included as a way of limiting them on that ration. So if you put enough salt in it, they won't eat any more. So, for example, sometimes people have ewes that are grain-fed ewes that are on self-feeders that are just too far forward. They don't have the stock to match it. They want to keep that number of grain feeders, so they avoid competition, etc. Well, one way of doing that is raising the salt content to the point where they'll slow down and eat it. Just remember, if you do that before lambing, because I'm conscious there's many of you who are pre-lambing, be very careful if you make any changes in feeding before lambing. Because if you make any sudden changes and their intake drops for a couple of days, you'll be calling Tim to come out and visit your farm. So you have to be quite careful with that planer nutrition at this period here. But the use of salt normally isn't automatically a direct requirement for sodium. There are some areas that are sodium deficient, but as a knockabout rule of thumb, that's not the reason that it's used. Mostly it's used to either limit, paradoxically, to either limit their intake at one end and to draw them in for the other, because stock will eat salt preferentially. So, you know, a classic mineral supply, I had a question of this in the interval, so we should talk about this, but a classic way of supplying minerals, cost effective and very effective way to do it, is to mix up lime, or for that matter dolomite or DCP, with salt, and if it's lime, it can be lime, salt and Corsmag. And that can be mixed up into a trough and just put out there for free access. Very inexpensive, very effective way to do that. The salt draws them onto that one. Salt used in a feeder ration typically is to limit how much they're going to eat. The MU8 systems that we talked on before, they had a roller lick, and some of those animals are just very determined. They just sit there and lick themselves to death. So what they began to do is put more and more salt into them. At a certain point, that would stop them. You know, they'd wait.
How much energy is that molasses body?
So the question for the back was, what's the ME content of molasses? Actually, relatively low, believe it or not. It's not particularly high. You think it is because it's supposedly full of sugars and it should be rocket fuel, but it's not. So most of the figures for molasses bounce in that 10.5 to 11.5 figure. If I'm using it myself for it all, I normally work on about 10.5 to 11. And there's one reason for that. Sugars versus starch, they have a lower total energy to begin with. They call it the gross energy, and sugars have a lower gross energy. Most of the figures that we had before, so fibre, starch, all of those things, if you extract all of the energy on them by burning them, that's the way you do it. The test is to burn them, called the gross energy. They'll normally be about 17.5 to 18 megajoules for every kilogram of dry matter. Sugars are much lower. If you get higher sugars, they're down to 15.8, 15.9. So molasses falls into that bracket. So the real ME value of it is typically a lot lower than it often presents. Yeah. So
White syrup, ethanol.
The extracts when they come through. So what happens with them? They take a lot of the carbohydrate out of them. So if you like, a good part of the energy source is used out of them, but because it's concentrated, the protein's higher. So typically what they're used for is a protein supply, not necessarily an energy supply. Having said that, the energy's reasonable in it.
So is it anywhere near molasses?
In terms of
comparing the two, like your wheat syrup and your molasses?
Oh, yeah, it's not too far away. In terms of energy, in terms of protein, molasses has next to none, and it's miles above molasses in terms of protein.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Molasses has very little protein. Hence they add the...
Yeah, it's about 150 a tonne, and your molasses blended is about 300. So.
And is that 150 wet weight though?
Yeah.
So you got to watch that, because sometimes that's a really lowish dry matter. Got to be a bit careful with some of them. They can be down to 30%, 35%. So, you know, compared to what you're buying with some of the others, wheat, for example, you multiply it by 3.
Yeah. At least they put it on straw in the grain.
So if you didn't hear that, I should have repeated that for it all. if you got the distilling leftovers with wheat, they've used up all of the energy out of it. But what it means is that what's left over, the protein gets concentrated because you've used up everything else on it. So on a per weight basis, the protein's going up and up and up. So it's used an awful lot overseas in confinement feeding for a whole range of things, dairies, feedlots, etc. It's a good system. Nothing wrong with that at all. Yeah. But it is a low dry matter, so you've got to be careful how you buy it because it's often quite low dry matter, and it varies a little bit how they present it to you.
Yeah, well, that's sold by the tonne, this liquid tonne.
Yeah.
26 tonne costs you.
Yeah.
$150 a tonne.
Yeah.
Would you be better off not putting your molasses in, say if you have your lime, cosmac, salt, just to moderate how much of it they eat? You'd be better off just leaving it out?
So, yep. So the question was, is there? I'll paraphrase. Is there a positive and negative about putting molasses in with the cosmag and lime and salt if you're feeding that out? Yeah, there are. So molasses, the value for that is that it's an energy supply and that it's a palliative, so it'll pull them on to eat it. So sometimes it's just used as the carrier to hold that calcium that you're supplying to them, or magnesium that you're supplying to them. You can use it. You can use that mix very effectively without molasses. I mean, you can use it as a tub mix that's on free access, and that can be very effectively done in sheep without molasses. There's no doubt about it. So you should think carefully about the way that you're using molasses, because for its price, as we were saying there before, it's not a particularly good per ME value down here. In Cuba, it's a pretty good value, I'm told. But and maybe in Cooktown or in North Queensland, it's quite close. It's also pretty cheap and pretty easy. But on an ME basis, as you get further and further away, you're trucking a lot of water, so it tends to be pretty expensive. So you have to use that carefully. Most of the time, when people are using molasses in drought systems, what they're really lacking is some immediate energy. They've got lots of fibre. It's slow. It's not very digestible. And they want some immediate energy, and that's what molasses is to provide. I think in this region, mostly you're providing that already with grains, so there's no great reason to do that. And at $300 a tonne, molasses doesn't stack up with grains. So.
Some loose slicks have got a water repellent on them. Now, when that goes into the gut, are they going to get still maximum or benefit out of the lime, salt, cosmag if it's got the water repellent on, or is it going to inhibit the intake, the body uptake?
No.
It's vegetable oil.
Yeah. So the question at the front is there. In some particular products, they have a coating. So they're loose slicks and they have a coating, and so they'll be held in a various form and they have a coating. And what I'll paraphrase your question. What's the positive and negatives of some of those coatings? So some of them you'll hear that they have a polythene glycol or a glucose-based one. Some are vegetable oil or another oil, lipid-based ones, and there's various ones. Here's where I think you need to be quite careful. In terms of minerals, I could have put up. Here's your three choices to decide those minerals. Cost, and cost again for them. So if you're just using lime and cosmag and salt, that's a very effective way to supply minerals to them. Now what's often said with the minerals is, okay, I'm going to change the formulation of this mineral and I'm going to increase its bioavailability. That's the word that's often used for it, bioavailability. So I'm going to increase its bioavailability by 20%. Okay, now I'm not very good at maths, but here's how I run it. Let's just say this costs me 10 cents and some magic new product costs me $1, right? And I use it and I get increased by 10%. Well, I'm not very good at maths, but even I can do that one. Why didn't I just double this one down here or multiply it by 10 if I needed to put it out all around the paddock so they couldn't walk around without tripping over it, and I still would have made more money on it. So you have to be quite careful. If it's being presented as a way that you're going to suddenly magically take up more of them, often beware. Mineral nutrition doesn't usually work like that.
We've been using this stuff. It comes out of the mill at Cuda, and we only use it because of the water repellent, but range not going to have to go tip water off tubs. It doesn't spoil. The water doesn't soak through it.
Yep. A lot of loose slicks are like that.
That's the only reason why we're using it.
Yep.
You can tip the water off and it's still dusty underneath it.
Yep. Did everyone hear that one there? So some of the loose slicks, one of the problems you got, which I imagine most people would appreciate this problem at the moment, is if it rained, and it rained a lot, you'd have to go out to the mineral tubs if they're open and tip the water off them, and it's true, you do. So there's a lot of so-called loose slicks that are made up, which is in various types of these, in granular forms, and they have some coating or another, and it means that they'll drain. You can put holes in the bottom and they'll drain, and it doesn't clog it. It doesn't, you know, they don't change their formulation. They're effectively waterproof. Yeah, I mean, as a practical, logistical bits and piece, no difficulty with that. What you need to be aware is that that doesn't necessarily change the way that they're used by the animals or in any way, shape or form.
We're just worried it would inhibit what they get out of it.
No, not at all. I mean, the lipid ones that are coated, like the oils and things that are coated, they're very digestible. They're gone really quickly. The polythene glycol ones probably even faster. So no difficulty with that. But you should look at that on a per unit cost basis. That'd be my suggestion.
We realise it is there.
Yeah.
It is a bit dear, yes.
It's usually not a bit.
It's not much more like we used to mix out the all the time, but
Right.
we went to this stuff there.
If it's cost effective and it helps your labour units, all you can make a case for it. Yeah. Right. Any more questions?
We might have to,
Apparently no more questions.
sorry, probably same questions all day, I think.